Our there we go. Invite our Dean of the Faculty of Community Services, Chiara Scarabaghi, to open us virtually. He couldn't be with us today.
Well, hello, everybody. I'm very sorry that I'm unable to be with you in person today. Public health measures keep me from showing up, so you can read between the lines. But I'm pleased to be able to join you virtually, at least. First of all, good afternoon and really welcome to our Alumni Month event entitled Restorative Justice, Black Youth and the Criminal Justice System. I'm Chiara Scarabaghi. I'm the Dean of the Faculty of Community Services, and I want to extend greetings also from our co-host from the Lincoln Alexander Law School and my colleague Donna Young, who's unable to, the Dean of that faculty, who's unable to be here with us as well. I want to first of all acknowledge the land. Toronto is in the dish with one spoon territory. The dish with one spoon is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and Haudenosaunee that bound them to share the territory and protect the land. Subsequent indigenous nations and peoples, Europeans and all newcomers have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. It's, as I read that land acknowledgement, of course, it's important to have a land acknowledgement in moments like this. It's also important to recognize that the connection between land and various settlers, both involuntary settlers and voluntary settlers, is a very significant one. And in a way, we're talking about Black youth today, but we're also talking about restorative practices. And of course, restorative practices are very closely tied to the land and have a deep, deep history in the way in which people and land connected to produce healing. So it has a special meaning in a way, at least for me, to read that land acknowledgement. The topic today also has a very special meaning to me because I've spent pretty much my entire adult life involved in work with young people, including Black youth who have been involved in youth criminal justice. And I suppose the one thing that I can say about that is that we are, there's some irony in using the term justice in relation to systems that have continuously really very significantly and very intentionally disadvantaged Black youth in particular, also indigenous youth and some others, but in particular, I think Black youth. I've spent an enormous amount of time over the years in virtually every custody facility in Ontario, and have had the repeat experience of finding just this enormous complacency toward what one experiences within those facilities in relation to what that actually means and says about how criminal justice unfolds in this country. I'm also very conscious that in the context of talking about the positive and the constructive and the restorative strength of communities in producing healing within their own ranks and for society at large in many ways. One always has to remember that a criminal justice system doesn't have boundaries at the doors of courthouses and custody facilities, but particularly in the context of the experiences of Black youth in Canada, discussions about the youth criminal justice system, of course, extend to discussions about the education system, about the child welfare system, even about the early childhood systems, and so on. So these things very rapidly, I think, help us understand that that the way in which we have created systems often simply upholds and perpetuates a particular form of power that disadvantages some in a very systematic way. So, but enough from me, because we have a phenomenal panel who is going to speak to all of these issues, and I can't wait to hear it all. To facilitate that panel, I'm really thrilled to introduce Sean Richard, who will be moderating the panel. Sean taught trial advocacy at the University of Toronto Faculty of Law and is a published author and frequent presenter. He currently teaches tort at Lincoln Alexander School of Law at Toronto Metropolitan University. Sean takes a creative, forward-thinking approach to finding solutions for clients, family, and estate litigation issues. He successfully argued Yanofkian versus Gullian, the first case in Canada to recognize the invasion of privacy tort of publicly placing a person in a false light to achieve compensation for his client for online abuse from her ex-spouse. Today's discussion is, of course, recorded, and the link to the video will be emailed to you following the event, but I do encourage you to really share this video across all of your networks. So welcome, Sean, and thank you for moderating our event. This is wonderful, and I can't wait for it to get started. Over to you.
Okay, hopefully, it works right away. So I think the first thing I should do is introduce our great panelists, one of whom is online, and I'm going to start with her. Dr. Annette Bailey is Associate Dean, Graduate Studies and Internationalization with the Faculty of Community Services. She holds a PhD in Public Health Science. Her research is focused on gun violence prevention, survivorship. Much of this work has shed light on deeply seated racial injustice inherent in Black victims, survivors' experience with gun violence and loss. Welcome, Annette. I had the pleasure of joining her on a panel 2 years ago. She's fantastic, so we're in for it today. Dr. Janelle Brady is an assistant professor in the School of Early Childhood Studies, Faculty of Community Services at Toronto Metropolitan University. She's an anti-racist educator, activist, researcher, and community organizer. Dr. Brady completed her PhD at the University of Toronto in the Department of Social Justice Education at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education, also known as OISE. Her doctoral work explored Black mothering experiences of navigating anti-Black racism in the schooling and education system for their children. Welcome, Janelle. And last but not least, Marlon, is it Marraro? Perfect. Yeah. Is a well-recognized social systems architect with a clear focus on poverty reduction and addressing the social determinants of health within a dynamic framework of equity and inclusion. He brings 25 years of experience in senior leadership positions within the nonprofit sector and municipal government, spearheading strategic strategies and tactical methods that address complex social issues, resulting in improved and more equitable health and community services. Welcome, Marlon. So I'm delighted to be here today. I think they gave the wrong bio because I know what it had to do with today's panel. If you're wondering about my sort of connection with all of this, I was one of the reviewers of the Peel District School Board for allegations of anti-racism, and that resulted in a report that hopefully had some positive impacts. But particularly in dealing with that report and then seeing, of course, everything that happened after the killing of George Floyd, it reminds me of an op-ed that we had from the great Masai Ujiri, bringer of a title to Toronto. He said in his op-ed that we had to deal with discussions about racism and inequality, and we were going to have some of those difficult discussions. And I don't think that we've had them quite yet. Hopefully we're going to have one of them today. But before we start, I think that we have to get on the same page about certain things. There are certain principles of social science and neuroscience that aren't, unfortunately, well understood, but inform the discussions and really give context to the stats and the results that we see and will be talking about today. And so there are papers out there in well-studied areas of research, again, neuroscience and sociology, with people like Dr. Kerry Kawakami at the Social Cognition Lab, Dr. Modio at NYU, who have these papers that talk about things like intergroup perception and cognition. You're like, what the heck is that? But when you read through the papers, they come to some basic truths through the research. One is that, at least in our environment, particularly with certain outgroups, including Black people, women, not all of our faces are actually fully recognized as human. That's a process that happens like that, quicker than that actually, and that has knock-on effects. And those knock-on effects are that in times of scarcity, we hoard resources away from what we call outgroups. Again, when I'm looking in the room, everybody on this panel is part of that outgroup, which is quite terrifying. But it has practical effects. When we think about cognition, we talk about bias. We think about people in outgroups tend to be less educated, more aggressive. When we see the research about Black youth, especially young children, there are a number of studies that show that Black children are perceived to be larger than they are, older than they are, more aggressive than they are. The thing that freaked me out when I got involved in the research is, of course, when they talk about perception, they literally are talking about perception, that bias impacts the way that we see the world, that there are individuals who their bias impacts their ability to accurately determine how large or small I am. And so, if you're doing a risk assessment and you're wondering whether or not I pose a danger to you, we need to be concerned about the biases that you harbor and how those biases are going to impact your decisions. When decisions over Black youth in schooling, deciding things like suspensions and expulsions, you're deciding who did what, who caused what, whether or not you're going to exercise your discretion to suspend a child, to call them out. You need to ask, why this child? Why in this circumstance? I had an office that backed onto a school, and I can tell you that at any moment, it's like Lord of the Flies. You just look anywhere and you can see an infraction that would be caught under the Education Act. But not every child is called out. And so there are questions about why are some children called out more than others. Do a little plug. You can look at the report, the dry report that we drafted, that's online. It's not that dry, hopefully not, but it includes important statistics about how particularly Black youth are impacted negatively within the second largest school board in the country. And I expect that you'd probably find it in every other school board where you have Black children. Anyway, on that note, I just wanted to give some context, and I don't want to take up too much time because we have these fabulous speakers and I'm just the moderator. So let's go to the first question. How does anti-Black racism influence how Black youth experience the criminal justice system? Who wants to start? Annette, I think everybody's pointing at you.
All right. I wonder if it's because my name begins with A. Yes. All right. So let me begin by saying that in the early years of my research with gun violence, I remember a young Black man who came up to me after a focus group, and he said, if you really want to understand gun violence, you will do three things. Number one, you will handle a gun to understand what the gun represents to disempowered people. Number two, you will walk through a cemetery to understand who guns kill. And three, walk through a prison or a detention center and look upon the faces of those in the system to understand why the gun. And so I've done 2 out of the 3 instructions that he's given me. I think my children would certainly disown me if I decided to pick up a gun, so I haven't done that. I'm not sure how many of you have ever walked through a prison or a youth center. I have, and I can tell you that I have literally felt the burden of racism as I looked upon the faces of so many Black and Indigenous youth who look back at me from behind the bars. And I can't help but think that those prison bars, they tell a story. They tell a story of racism in the same way that the miles of graves belonging to young Black victims of gun violence in Toronto cemeteries tell a story of racism. We are often told that the pathway to prison to the prison system is a complex legacy of colonization and racism for Indigenous and Black, particular Black youth and Indigenous youth who continue to be overrepresented in the criminal justice system, by the way. In my research with Black youth, Black survivors of gun violence, what was striking in the finding is that racial trauma stood out as a critical factor in their involvement with the criminal justice system. These are youth that continually have to navigate the loss of multiple friends and family members to gun violence in Toronto, all while they are dealing with circumstances of poverty, exposure to community violence, excessive, as you've just talked about, Sean, excessive school suspensions, and negative interactions with the police. And these are very highly specific race-based trauma experiences that the research is showing alters the way that they view themselves, view the world, and how they interact with people within their environment. But what was most striking in the interviews with these Black youth is how they spoke about their interactions with the police. One of the youth, and I have to read this quote, says that when the cops stop you, they always start with this phrase: there's been a robbery in the area, and then they slam you against the car and search you. Some cops just pull out a gun on you, even when you don't do nothing. Cops see us as a threat, criminals, not victims. And so, I reflect on that quote and imagine what happens when a youth like that, with such heightened level of trauma, enters the criminal justice system. How that trauma compounds, especially with long sentences that are given to them. And if and when they're able to get out of the system, they go into families, and this compounded trauma gets translated, gets transmitted into families as intergenerational trauma. So we cannot separate racialized youth, especially Black youth's experience with the criminal justice from their racial experiences. Racism is a slow structural violence that embeds in all aspects of their life. And it's funny, as I speak to people, some people will say, well, I don't think the problem is racism. I think the problem is poverty. And so I say poverty is always entrenched in social, racial structures of society that are very compelling to the experiences of racialized youth with the criminal justice system. And then other people will say, well, it's criminality that's the problem. But criminality is born from the context of racial and structural violence. And often I hear, no, it's family dysfunction. That's the real problem. But the dynamics of racialized families are never in isolation of their oppressed lived experiences. So again, we cannot separate the experiences of racialized youth with the criminal justice system from their racial experiences.
Janelle, what do you see from your work?
Thank you so much, Sean and Annette, for sharing that. From my work, I would agree that these are the experiences that Black youth are facing. My work starts in the early years, and particularly I'm looking at the experiences of Black mothers and the roles that they play in the education and the advocacy for their youth and their children and wider communities. And what I was able to see when I started doing youth programming as a youth myself was that there are very particular structured pathways, which is based on streaming in the education system, which has long been studied on, researched, and accounted for. And what that means is that Black students are pointed to particular pathways that leads to limited post-secondary options for them. And it's not to say that other options are not valid or important, but that they're not even given the choices. So I was able to identify that alongside other youth in the Jane Finch community while we were navigating the education system, the university system ourselves, and trying to provide mentorship to younger youth going through the high school system. And that was particularly something that was striking to me in terms of the role of the education system, because you could look at a school board like the Toronto District School Board, who has a Learning Opportunity Index, the LOI Index, which kind of provides a ranking for where schools are at in terms of highest need, lowest to highest need. And a lot of the needs are assessed based on external factors. So at least there's an acknowledgement of some of the external factors having to do with, families' access to resources, access to extracurricular supports, parents who have post-secondary education, and how that can help in terms of supporting their children in their schooling and education. But there are also the internal factors, which are very important. To Sean's point earlier and to Annette's point just now too, in terms of the school system. In particular, there's higher suspension rates for Black students, and that has been investigated over the years. There have been some practices to remedy that now. It's not uncommon for Black youth to be suspended in the school system, even for very minor incidences. And I myself went through the Toronto District School Board and the Peel School Board as well, and I was suspended. And that's, if you sit with a group of, 5 people, they'll share that similar experience, as well as these limited pathways and the encouragement or lack of that you receive from guidance counselors in terms of which pathways you should take in terms of your education, having to prove yourself and work twice as hard and that sort of thing. That's also a reality. And I also did some work in Peel too, with the We Rise Together. I can never say that word, that sentence together, but the We Rise Together report. I helped to write that report alongside Sam Tekle and Roseanne Bailey and Elena Gray. And the findings just kind of confirm some of those anecdotal experiences that I was able to see in youth mentorship programs, around higher rates of suspension, higher rates of expulsion, lower expectations of Black student learners as well. And these lower expectations have a ripple effect, of course. And a lot of it was over 100 Black male students who were interviewed for the project. And a lot of those students pointed to the fact that even if they are doing well, there are a lot of microaggressions that they had to face as well, not only by other students, but by educators, administrators, educational support workers too, in terms of them not being Black enough. So there's perceptions of Blackness which kind of color anti-Black racism, and the students are not only having to do their work, their schoolwork, and prove themselves academically, but they're having to combat these microaggressions on a daily basis. So there's a plethora of issues that Black youth are facing. And the reason why I'm focusing on the education system is that I see how these systems are intertwined and interconnected, although there's sometimes, I would say, a bit of a inclination to say that they're mutually exclusive or they're different. So criminal justice system is not the education system, but the two go hand in hand. And as Kiara said too, it starts even earlier too, with regards to the child welfare system. So you could actually look at reports like the Ontario Human Rights Commission's report on interrupted childhoods in 2018. And that report shows that who makes up the child welfare system is largely Black and Indigenous children. So it's not even only starting at the educational level, but also prior to that. in terms of who is afforded. In my field, we speak a lot about critical education, early childhood. Scholars speak a lot about childhood innocence and who is considered innocent. And relating to what Sean had mentioned in terms of perceptions and size and that sort of thing, there's an adultification of Black children. We can nuance that with Black intersectionalities, and perhaps I could speak to that more a bit later on too. But these issues are interconnected, and it's part of the colonial system to see things as fragmented and separate and different. But I think part of what we're able to address today, hopefully, is looking at the fluidity between multiple systems. And finally, Black mothers play a very pivotal role in terms of the advocacy and supports of their children, but that often goes unnoticed or is policed within the school system. So with the Black mothers who I worked with during my PhD study, a lot of them would say that they cannot, a few of them would say that they are not able to enter school grounds because there are harassment charges being laid on them. Because when they go in to advocate for their children or support their children or other children in the community, that's being read under different tropes or lenses, like what Patricia Hill Collins speaks about, the 4 controlling images of Black women, the angry Black woman trope. But when a white middle class mother goes in to do the same thing, to speak about supports and resources for their child, that's classified as perhaps intensive parenting or helicopter parenting. So there are these mismatches within the systems. And I do like to think about that community aspect too, because I think that's really important for Black community members. And it's kind of a way of pushing it back against grand narratives that try to individualize larger social and structural problems.
Thank you. And when you're talking about sort of the synonyms that are used maybe for white mothers, is thinking, caring, active, involved. And just to put some context on the suspension data, certainly at Appeal, we saw significant numbers of junior kindergartners who were being suspended, which is probably what caused the real furor and desire to make a change to wipe out suspensions up to grade 3. Touching on what you're saying, Annette, in terms of that blame, and now we've got the perspective of what's happening in youth and sort of the alienation of women as well. As a social system architect, first of all, what is a social system architect?
It's a good question. A social systems architect is someone that works, like myself, who works across various systems that we have in our social contract for us to do social good and taking care of each other. So my work and professional and personal life, I've worked in health, community services, community development, the justice system, and housing. And through that span of time, I've seen, and for folks who are online and here who may be differently abled, I'm a Black guy. I think I'm young. I have some gray hair, but I think I'm youthful. So I'm going to speak like a youthful person. I'm 24 years old, by the way. 24 years old. And I'm going to stick to that even though it's recording. And so over those years, what I've seen when we talk about what Black youth face in the criminal justice system, it's to some of the points that have been raised earlier. They are not just Black youth experiencing the justice system. There are Black youth too who are from families. There are Black youth who are experiencing their mothers' and fathers' pain of not being able to do the things that they need to do when they're experiencing the justice system. There are Black youth that have to feel alone, like myself in a family of 10, while you experience the justice system. There are Black youth that experience the justice system that moves them from institution to institution within our social safety net. That's what they're experiencing. And not getting the answers or the supports in those systems because the systems are designed to perpetuate the agency in regards to whatever that social service provider is. or the mission and mandate to continue for the organization to thrive as it relates to funding and their prominence within a social service sector. Black youth experience a justice system that enables them to be out of school, be in over-policed communities, face issues of poverty that have no redress. Black youth experience these systems in ways that I think is actually criminal. By the way we as adults, we as systems, take care of those who we are tasked to take care of, who we tell as a society that we are going to take care of you from the time you're born, and we do a really poor job of it, especially for particular groups. One of the questions I just want to throw out to folks to think about is, when you hear the title or the question, what are Black youth experiencing in the justice system? What's an image that comes to your mind? Just throw it out, please, throw it out. Anyone, don't let me, I'm gonna pick you. Harassment. And justice. An image of the person. Young Black teenager. Most likely male? Yeah, let's be fair. That's what comes to my mind, right? Most likely male, right? Who's a teenager, most likely between the ages of 12 to 18. That's what we think about youth, right? But what if I was to say to you that maybe that image even of itself, for those of us who work in social services, even that image is problematic. To your point around what the medical evidence is, that youth is a developing stage of our life. It doesn't stop at 18. So they're experiencing a system that doesn't even understand the medical evidence that's there to inform the policies and practices so that they can, if they're having challenges or difficult transition in life in the justice, and they end up in the justice system, that evidence that's there is not even being used to help them navigate through that system. That's what they're experiencing. They may not be able to tell you like how we can tell you, how you, from a legal perspective, from my colleagues from an academic perspective, but they'll tell you clearly what they're experiencing by giving Annette the questions around and pick up a gun, go down, check out the range, etc. So I think they're experiencing things that is isolating. And then you throw on the three drivers, for me, the three drivers, child welfare, education, and justice, and you put those into the mix, because that's where disproportionately sits right now. It's a fact, not something we need to debate. Who are we talking about? We know who we are talking about. So Black youth are seeing this evidence around them and yet feel a sense of powerlessness. And they're wondering to Marlins and the Marshas and the Louis Marshes and the Angela Robertsons and all the other folks who are trying to disrupt how we do this work, they're looking at us too, because this is how I feel sometimes. Like, actually, I feel a lot of, and I made a joke about being young, but I also feel a lot of alignment with those feelings that those young people face. Because even in doing this work, there's a cost to doing this work. So I also feel lonely working in the justice system. I also feel lonely having to go to a Children's Aid board meeting tonight with 17 or 22 people and feel lonely around how do we address the disproportionality of Black and racialized youth in the child welfare system and the connection to the justice system, the double whammies that they face. I also feel lonely. So I feel in a lot of ways very similar to the experiences of those Black youth, but yet I'm a grown man. I was about to swear, I didn't swear. You know what I'm gonna say, a beat man, right? And yet I still feel in many ways those experiences that those young Black youth face. That's scary. And I have to tell them and be honest with them about that feeling so that I'm not giving them this false sense of security that the Marlins and others like Marlins and the Janelles and all these other folks that I know are going to fix this immediately because I've been doing this for 30 years. And so there's a sense of powerlessness for those Black youth. And that in itself, when you compound that with what folks who are trying to disrupt that system, that is a dangerous combination for us as a community. So I know where the question is, how do they feel? But how do they feel is in context of how the adults also around them feel in supporting them through those systems and having to go to court. Real story, having to go to court, your mother comes in there and goes, I can't believe you make the police come to my house, Star. And he's like, where's your shoes? Well, the police took my shoes. Well, how are we getting home? We got to take the bus. It's February. Taking the bus with no shoes with your mom in February from Finch Court, trust me, is traumatic. And so those experiences don't go away. And I think that's my experience. But that experience doesn't go away for people like me who have had those experiences, but it doesn't go away for Black youth. So yeah, they're 14, 15, 16, then they turn 55 and they remember that day. And that's a lonely feeling at the end of the day. And I think those are some of the pieces of work that we have to do. And when we talk a little bit later on around restorative justice and how that can be helpful, I think there's some things for us as a community and as people in the change-making world to look at. It's not just about service, but those traumas that Janelle talked about and what we need to do with that.
So it seems like what I'm hearing is a theme of one, fragmentation on all levels, from institutions to within school boards and even within families, and disempowerment.
Mm-hmm.
Or you say those are two themes that unfortunately seem to be pervading all of it. On that topic of restorative justice, I guess the first question is, because we talk about it, what is restorative justice from your perspective as something that you see as, I don't know, maybe holding out promise to address these issues? Who wants to jump onto that one first? Annette, they keep on looking at you.
Just wanted to read the body cues. I'll go ahead.
You go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, so restorative justice, to me, it's very much aligned with like African Indigenous knowledges, Afrocentric ways of knowing and being. It comes from Indigenous knowledges and practices, where it's not just about discipline and taking punitive measures, but it's really about how do you restore relations, and how do you restore relations to oneself, one's community, and all of those around that person. So I see it as something that's embedded in sharing and mutuality. And in terms of the examples I give around, the education and the school system, and also in early years, I see it as something that can really be a positive, provide positive learning opportunities. Lance McCready wrote about that in 2009, the learning opportunities that come from restorative justice. But with restorative justice, it's important to also ensure that, let's say, for instance, Michelle Bailey wrote about it in an edited collection that I worked on alongside another scholar, Francisco Villegas. And what Michelle had written is that this was a positive practice in the Toronto District School Board when applied restorative justice principles. So really not saying, okay, I'm just going to take this child and suspend them, but I'm going to think about having a conversation with them and really focusing on the relationships. So in that article, Michelle was able to hone in on the relationships between the student and the vice principal in that case, and how that helped the student with their flourishing, their learning, wanting to even come to school. It increased their attendance rate. And some other scholars have also looked at how when you implement restorative justice, which is based on those principles that I spoke about, you could see where it decreases suspension rates, it decreases expulsions. But when one issue is if it's just applied through a colorblind lens. And one of my colleagues in early childhood spoke about this, Dr. Rachel Berman. Colorblind attitudes in early childhood sector overall. Sometimes with childhood innocence, there's an assumption that children are too young to think about race and racism. So not to go on too much of a tangent, but Dr. Berman's work looked at these colorblind perceptions, which move people away from acknowledging and naming race and racism in explicit ways. I think the same issue can be applied to restorative justice if it's just applied as a neutral type practice without really focusing on the issues of race and racism, which we've all pointed to. Because then it's at the discretion of administrators, if we're thinking about the schools, administrators of who to apply, a restorative justice practice for or who not to. And you start to see that disproportionality be reinforced once again. And there's some scholars who looked at that. Yes, Davison et al. In 2022. I need to look at the names, but they looked at the ills of only applying restorative justice practices through a colorblind or a neutrality lens. So all just to say, restorative justice is about providing justice and supports for people who have been historically and presently disenfranchised and marginalized. And it's an acknowledgement that these are social issues that do take place. And it's looking at relationships within, between the two people. Let's say if there's an altercation, looking at the relationship between those two people. If it's a student, the relationship with the student and the administrator, but also at a broader level, like just going back to the point on fragmentation, looking at not just that one particular incident, but what does that mean for the wider education system? Because restorative justice in terms of education as linked to the criminal justice system can't just be individualized to very specific problems. It has to look at the broader institutions that you're working within. So how do you embed these practices into daily affirmations or the relationships that children are having between each other? So it's not just a response to quote unquote negative behaviors or behaviors that you'd like to manage in that given moment or situation. So that's what I make of it.
And Marlon,
If I could just touch on what my friend was saying, because restorative justice traditionally speaks to repairing harm between two individuals. And to your point around bringing restorative justice practices, whether it's a justice system, child welfare, how I've seen it across these different systems is that it's someone does something wrong, you need to then fix what you've done wrong, repair the harm that you've done. And I think what's happening now is restorative justice is enabling us to have a different type of conversation. So a conversation not just about what did Marlon do wrong that he needs to repair, but a conversation of what is the social context that Marlon lives in that also needs to do some repairs. So the justice system has, reconciliation is a huge word right now. We're using it quite often, but reconciliation, the justice system has some reconciling to do. And then if you talk about child welfare, there's some reconciliation that needs to happen. Education system, there's some reconciliation that needs to happen. And so what restorative justice, I think, how we can use restorative justice to change it or move it away from these two individuals, that you need to fix something, a relationship between these two individuals, to how does restorative justice enable systems that have historically and traditionally caused harm, repair the harm that they caused. They as in institutions or individuals, right? So how does restorative justice and child welfare look like in reducing the number of youth in care who are in care, lack support, and are also in the justice system not getting any support, and the child welfare system is not helping get support, and then they get deported, and that's one of the problems that child welfare system is experiencing. So how does restorative justice as a model then help with that situation? We then need to move that conversation from just the Marlon and this person that he harmed to the reconciliation of those systems in dealing with the issues that they have perpetuated for a long time. There has to be some reconciling here, or else we'll just would you, okay, I don't want to sound negative, but stay positive. We will just be then perpetuating, when we look at how restorative justice is used, is through diversion programs. If you go and talk, Marlon, you go talk to Marsha, if you guys could, you hammer it out, fix what you did wrong, we're good. But Marlon still has problems that were created by the police officer that didn't have me and you just sit down and have a conversation about something, or the school teacher or the school administrators that created a situation, that enabled a situation for the police to be called in the first place, and not looking at what can we do to help change or rebuild a relationship that's been harmed. So I think restorative justice is a great model to address issues of disproportionality within those systems, but it's also a great model for us as folks here in academia, in the community, to have the conversation or make the argument that restorative justice can help those systems repair the harm that they have caused in a way that people could get, because we already have the research. We know this. Our folks here on this panel have done the research. We know what is causing the harm. So why not ask these systems to adopt the restorative justice model to repair the harm that the system has caused, and not just tweak a program or create a diversion program that you fund today, but you don't have it next year. I think that's the way for restorative justice to actually help, not just look at individuals, but systems and individuals, or systems and groups of individuals.
Annette, touching on.
I'm really liking what I'm hearing, because what you just said, Marlon and Janelle, really sums up the conversation that I've been having with Black youth and Black mentors over the years. We've asked this question about what restorative justice mean to them, would look like for them. So all that you've said is so relevant to what I'm hearing. First of all, I'm hearing that restorative justice for particularly Black youth should go beyond the criminal justice system, which is what you're saying. That all systems that Black youth and racialized youth interact with are spaces for restorative justice. And so, as you said, Janelle, the school system is a space for restorative justice, especially as we think about the impact that increase and excessive suspensions have had on Black youth over the years, right? Many of our Black youth are talking about how many Black youth are suspended and what happens to those Black youth when they're suspended. I didn't know that there is something in place that when Black youth are suspended, they are immediately recruited into gangs. Like, you know, the young people would say, gangsters, just look out for those youth who are suspended and recruit them into the gang. So the school needs to construct their own restorative justice framework. And as you said, Janelle, it's one that has to be focused on how they interact with Black youth and how they understand the racial experiences of Black youth. Oh, did I miss something?
It was one of those Zoom pauses.
Oh, okay. Are you hearing me well now?
We are.
Oh, perfect. So one of the other things that stood out to me in conversations with many of these youth is that restorative justice should not be a mechanism for intervention, that it should be a part of our culture, which you just mentioned, Marlon. If we think about restorative justice as a culture, as something that should be a part of how we live, it can be as simple as sitting down at a family dinner table, you know, like we did in the Caribbean, where the matriarch or the patriarch of a family listens to what is going on with the young person in the family and offers advice. into how they navigate, how they negotiate the challenges that they're having. And that's exactly what restorative justice is meant to be. It's meant to be transformational, but it's evolved into a situation for criminal justice, which makes it, as many of the youth have said, more transactional than it is transformational. And I say transactional because it becomes just an extension of the regular transactional processes that happen after a crime is committed, which is not, a purposeful process of healing that they integrate into the system. And the last thing that you both have said is that restorative justice is about systems, not merely about people. We've gotten so focused on restoring the person, restoring the youth, that we forget that the youth or the person is a product of systems that honestly punish more than they allow for people to prosper. Systems that continue to exert very oppressive pressures on people who, especially those who lack internal locus of control, like we see in many of our youth, right? Racialized youth, as we know, their experiences are fundamentally impacted by structures of inequities and colonial structures, which feed into their experiences with racism, the high trauma that we're seeing among them, poverty and criminality. So we cannot, and this is important, one of the young persons said, we cannot restore racialized youth in a criminal justice system that is simultaneously harming them. There is no transformation in a process that try to restore as it destroys.
Okay. So we've talked about restorative justice as not being a individual thing, as fundamentally not being a colorblind thing. Doesn't really make sense to me intellectually, but that's another story. Being something that is both involving the individual and society, but also society as a system itself, and its own reflection. And we know that programs that are either temporary or poorly funded and that are based maybe merely on criminal law, like diversion programs that Marlon talked about, are not the solution. So, to be concrete, what are some of those solutions, short-term, long-term, that you can point to as ideas, float out there as possible solutions for the issues that we're facing that really address this idea of restorative justice?
There's one piece of work that I'm, everywhere I could go and talk about this, I think I do, so just bear with me for a second. When we talk about youth justice and we stick to what the provincial government defines as youth, who ends up in the Roy, when you think about those numbers of youth, you will not see a number of over 2,000 young people in the system. Doesn't exist right now. And so one of the things, and this, I'm saying this with some belief, some not belief, but one of the things that I've come to recognize is that the Youth Justice Act, it's been working. It's been working because there are less young people who are incarcerated today than there was 10 years ago, 20 years ago. The numbers have drastically dropped. Don't take my word for it. Go and ask the ministry. They'll tell you. Numbers have dropped and they've closed detention centers. They may have closed it. They could have done better with it, right? But they did, okay, they did a terrible job of closing them, but they've closed it. The budgets for that ministry and those for youth justice has not gone down. The numbers have drastically dropped. The act is working, but your budget hasn't moved someplace else. So there's a fundamental problem. So, not that I'm a smart person, one of my thoughts was, Well, if the YCJA is working to some extent, and not for everybody the same impact on the YC. So if it's working, and our current problem is 19 to 27, look at those numbers through the roof. And we know who those people are, we know who they look, and we know what neighborhoods they come from, and we know what issues of poverty, et cetera, and trauma that they face. We know who they are. 19 to 27, numbers through the roof. So here's my brilliant idea, or maybe not so brilliant. Is it possible for us to rethink the 19 to 27 and maybe not consider them the adults that we want to consider them? Let's test it and see. Why not? Why not? And if we could say that they are in social service language, the emerging adults, if we could say yes, they're emerging adults, and we could take some of what the YCJ has been successful in keeping young people out of incarceration, and diversion programs that are targeted to address that disproportionality, then maybe that new problem that we have can be addressed in regards to the who is being impacted, Indigenous and Black young people who are now filling up the adult system. Filling up the adult system. Maybe there's some of those components of that act that can help those emerging adults. If we can agree that science, like you said, has some truth in it around the brain development is still developing right to your 27. I don't know, I can't source that, but you can look it up, it's true, right? If that's true, if the science is true, the act is working, we have the money, because we put money into anti-gang programs, millions of dollars. Those programs don't exist anymore because those millions of dollars don't exist because it's not politically expedient. I get that. But if we could invest the same way we did with that age group on the YCJA, maybe that might help us address the issues of the 19 to 27s, that it's a serious current problem now, that youth is not at the same way, because the numbers of the young people who are incarcerated right now and what they're incarcerated for, we're talking about complex mental health. And now because of all the carjackings, you're seeing the Roy fill up with carjackers. But if you take that out, it's the complex mental health that's filling up the Roy right now. Guaranteed. And so maybe there's a lesson to be learned there around what our sector could do, and maybe what some of the folks who are within this institution and other institutions and the legal minds might be able to help us figure out, how do we do that? How do we do that? How do we get that political action, and how do we get a community of organization and community leaders to think about taking some of what is working, because you can't always say something is working and then say, well, true story, bear with me, one true story. I'm in a meeting, I'm telling the ministry people listen, youth incarceration is a problem, it's a problem, it's a problem. You guys are doing a shitty job. What's wrong with you people? You should feel bad, shame, shame, shame. And then they told me some numbers and I'm like, oh, I didn't know that. I'm like, you don't have that many young people in? Diversion is working? And I didn't have an answer for them. I didn't have an answer for them. So there's some information that's sitting in that ministry that we may not know, and they'll tell you if you go to a meeting and you're having the conversation. But I think that is part of how we can learn from what is working, because sometimes stuff that we may have an argument with, some of it does work. And we have to be uncomfortably accepting of that. And I think that's one of the things where I think restorative justice model, looking at the YCJA and taking some of what's working there and taking it for that age group, I think would be helpful in reducing the numbers and the impact on Black and racialized youth. And I am not saying for a minute, I don't want no one to think anywhere out there in the world that I'm saying that people should not be held accountable for their actions. I don't want that to be, I don't think any one of us are saying that. But we do know that systems allow folks to do things that sometimes they don't want to do. And we recognize that piece too. We haven't said that collectively, but just throwing it out there because you never know. Marlon said we should hug the thug. That's not my quote, someone else's quote. So yeah, that's one of the answers I think we could use.
Annette?
Thank you, Marlon. I didn't know that the numbers were lower than normal, so thank you for letting us know that. I think at this point, almost any solution we throw out would be important because of the limited supports that these youth have at all levels. So solutions are necessary at all levels. But I think a major challenge is in criminal justice policies and practices. I think that these policies and practices, there's a failure for them to engage with the issue of race. And this is why scholars like Dr. Adiji and Mullins from Memorial University recommend that the criminal justice system, that their practices and their policies should undergo what they call a race-based intersectional analysis to understand the consequences that they have on racialized people. They suggest that this analysis should be a conscious, systematic review or an assessment of where racism dominates policy decisions in the criminal justice system and in systems outside of that as well. And where policies have not considered the context of racialized people's lives, especially those policies that disproportionately affect Blacks and Indigenous people. And so what I'm saying is that we need a consideration of equity in judicial policies and practices. And we know that equity considers where people are at and what the experiences they've had that have impacted on the choices that they make. And when we think about these changing times, COVID-19 has taught us a lot. But these changing times have brought some awareness of the impact of especially anti-Black racism on the outcomes of Blacks. And so what we're seeing now is that several organizations are entering into discussions about equity policies and as well regulatory changes to confront anti-Black racism. But if there's ever a system that requires this kind of equity policy work, it's the justice system. And I like what Kara says earlier about, can we really call this a justice system given where we're at? And it's never an easy approach to take to address race-based intersectional analysis within the criminal justice system. Because the question that is often asked is, how can we rationalize policy changes in a system that people have become so comfortable with? A system that is constructed brick by brick on racist ideology. And so this is why I say it's not going to be easy, but if you really want to see some significant changes over time in terms of systemic empathy, then we have to start with just traditional policies, I think.
So we've seen earlier this year, one of the people who's supposed to be on the panel, Faisal Mirza, who's now Justice Mirza, that's how he got out of the panel. I say that because he's a friend. We saw with the case that he argued, Morris, that dealt with pre-sentencing reports in giving greater context, but as somebody who's part of the legal system, the reality is that's far downstream, right? at that point, you've now have a conviction way downstream. You've had either a plea or a trial. So you've had a charge, you've had incarceration during that time. That person's been removed from family, job, education. And so going back to what all of you are saying about how the justice system is only one component of it, I want to push back a little bit and push you all to say, hold on a minute. What specific interventions can we get that are early? And Janelle, I think you're probably best suited to talk about those issues.
Very early on. Yeah, no, thank you for bringing up the IRCAs. I was going to mention that too, that is a promising practice for sure. Like looking at, I think the acronym is Impact of Race and Culture Assessments. And that is a promising practice because it looks at, you know, the social conditions of the person who's at that point been convicted. So that is a starting point, and it's considering and acknowledging, just as Sean set up this panel today, that race and racism is a fact. So it's acknowledging that that is the place of starting. But to think, and it does pull from the glad you principle as well as a promising practice. I say promising because we could always do better, but it's not to say we're going to throw one thing out the window and just only focus on the other. I think all of these practices and principles can work in relation with one another, but creating a culture and a context that's less focused on punishment from a very young age, I think is really important, and just embedding it in relationships and relationality between people. I believe Kiara's brought up this idea of relationality to land as well. Like that's so important in terms of thinking about Black youth and Indigenous youth, what was taken from them through the process of colonization, or continues to be something that pushes them out of these systems. So I think starting these conversations early is really important, and focusing on, for Black youth, focusing on their childhoods from early on in terms of Black joy and Black flourishing, not just focusing on the deficit or the negative aspects, but what do Black children bring when they come to a early on center, and how can you kind of expand on their experiences? Like for instance, today, students in the class I teach were discussing other mothering practices because we're looking at the work of Black feminist scholars, bell hooks, in terms of family and Canadian context, of course. And we're thinking about how for a lot of Black communities and Indigenous communities, for early childhood professionals to understand that the focus and the emphasis isn't always just on the nuclear family or nuclear parent household, or just the mother assuming, you know, full responsibility, being able to work, being able to take care of the child, being able to do everything basically and become the ultimate girl boss. Really what we're looking at is like, how can mothers look at community and wider systems of support, and how that through social policy has been with the removal of different social structures and policies or supports that were in place and resources, how that then becomes something that's individualized. But we were thinking about how other mothers, non-biological mothers, play a very prevalent role in Black communities and Black families. And you know, you might have someone who's an auntie who isn't biologically related to you. So bringing it back to those early years, when a child comes into a care setting, it's important for the educator to hopefully have that experience as well, because a lot of the South Asian students in class said, this is something that's very common and prevalent in my community. Most of the students in the class had some sort of connection to that concept of other mothering, which is part of Black feminisms. And we were able to also relate it to Indigenous motherhoods, where it's political, it's about the family, the clan. It's not only about this individual family and biological unit. So really, in the early years, it's about accepting those practices, and not only accepting them, but using them to push back against grand narratives that would say that, because auntie is dropping off the child to this center, that means that their family is neglectful. And then you start to see the ripple effect where that child starts to become more policed, and the family is getting under has more surveillance placed on them, because then there's suspicion that perhaps they should be placed into a child care setting because of neglectful parents. But I think in terms of Black childhoods, this is one place where we could think of restorative justice practices, not only about like all of the panelists have said, not only about those individual instances, but about shifting the culture, shifting norms, shifting the ideas, and shifting our perceptions more widely around what is considered a good childhood and a bad childhood from a very, very young age. And part of that is also focusing on communities and what role the communities play in terms of education, support, and not only focusing on the individual, because right now there tends to be a very fixated approach on child-centered approaches, which is important because it is looking at the rights of a child, which is part of there's a Charter of the Rights of a Child coming from the UN in 1989. So it is thinking about those children's rights, but at the same time, how can we also think of those rights in tandem with community and relationality? Because that would help to normalize moving beyond the individual and not only focusing on punitive measures when something goes wrong, but thinking about how is this space configured to ensure that students are able to not only compete against each other for like a grade or that sort of thing, but to be in relation with one another. And I would just add one more thing in response to what Marlon said. The 19 to 27 category, I think that's really brilliant in terms of your thoughts around what we could do around restorative justice, because really, even if it isn't medically proven, I think that's what a lot of critical early childhood scholars tend to think of, is childhood is socially constructed in the first place. So when we think about the students who walk through the doors here at TMU, often they're considered youth, right? And they're not considered as, sometimes it's debatable, but they're considered youth living out their youth experiences, going to college, university, and having all of these experiences that are associated with youth. So really, how can we shift the focus with the YCJA around that social construction? So I think it's really important, and I was really struck by how that has shifted as well. So I wrote it down. Thank you.
So,
Yes.
so I hear one, possible reinvestment of funds for things like mental health and supports, focusing on older populations. I also hear in early childhood reframing discussions, even in just experiencing with children and talking about the sort of disempowering, turning on its head, and maybe empowering and integrating different people who are part of a child's environment, and as opposed to jumping to the conclusion that a child's being neglected, but encouraging that person who comes in as not the mother or father to be involved and integrated into the community of that child as sort of practical suggestions here. But I also hear a lot of sort of intersectionality and, problematic and all other academic language that I'm guilty of too as a teacher. What is the Academy supposed to do here? What sort of obligations do we have? I poked at the neuroscientists and the social scientists for their intergroup perception and cognition, their lack of accessibility in language and the density of their research. What are our responsibilities as part of the Academy? What can we be doing differently to empower others?
Could also do some reconciliation too. Because when you think about whose models come out of the Academy into government, there is a direct correlation to then what gets implemented into the Roy, what gets implemented into their mental health programs, and whose conversation and whose truth is being told. So I love the universities and I love all those folks, don't get me wrong, but I think if we're talking about on an organizational level, the community organizations have some, nonprofit sector has some reconciliation to do too, because they promote whiteness. They don't have diverse boards. They promote policies to perpetuate a system that uses the horrible experiences of Black and racialized folks to their benefit. That's my analysis. Sorry about that. The other piece is universities also have a role to play in regards to how are you reconciling what you are providing to government to create legislation, to create policies and protocols and practices. Who's sitting at that table? It's not Christina Sharp. It's not Dr. Roberta Timothy. It's not Dr. Evelyn Kesey. There's a bunch of, and it's not the Black feminists that are sitting at those tables informing government. And if I'm wrong, someone could shoot me an email, tell me I'm wrong, but it's not those voices. And so there's a role for academia to reconcile whose research and whose designs are being put forward and encouraged within that relationship with government. And I would say there needs to be, folks need to do some work on this from an institutional standpoint, because I think like folks you see here on the panel, they're doing that work. They're doing that work, but are they being engaged to help to produce that new model of youth justice within the provincial government? I don't think so.
When you talk about promoting whiteness, are you talking about sort of access and voice, or is there something else?
I think promoting whiteness is not understanding, especially in the work that we're doing about healing, because Janelle talked about healing. So when I'm doing the work within community and I'm talking about healing to government and to funders, and they're looking at me like there's something wrong with me. And I'm like, no, we can't say that we have harmed you. We'll give you anti-gang money, but we don't think healing is important so that you don't join this particular group of people doing these particular things. And so there are ways of doing that is different. And how do we bring that difference in the nonprofit sector, which a university is part of, one of the bigger players? There is a hierarchy of who's being listened to. And I would like to make the argument, and I think folks who are more in it than I am, that Black feminists aren't the leaders of that. They're fighters for it, but they're not the leaders of that. And I think we need to just speak that truth. And if the university could reconcile that conversation with folks, then I think there will be different making. But we can't ignore those truths too. And I say that in criticism of universities and colleges, but I'm also criticizing the nonprofit sector and community organization that also perpetuate a particular way of doing that may be different than how I, from my collective community of Blackness, would see doing work with youth in community around healing, around the uncles and aunties, around sitting in someone's living room and have tea with them because that's what they need to do. And you don't have a policy that tells you can't go do that. Because then you're breaking the organizational rules and then you're gonna get fired. You gotta find a new job and find another place to display your Blackness. So I think there is and concept of whiteness and white doing is being perpetuated in all of these systems. And so when I say reconciliation for academia, I think that's the first step, and to promote those voices that are not being promoted. And I would say start with Black feminists.
I think we're running out of time before the question pieces, but yeah. I want to give each of you an opportunity to comment on the academia. It's probably not fair. The academics don't have to be held account.
Well, I think it's really important to think about the role of the academy and the colonial harm that the Academy has imposed on Black and Indigenous communities, not only historically, but up until today. So I think it's really important to consider the role of the Academy and work towards decolonial practices to break down that harm that has been imparted. So there are different types of methodologies that can be used within community to ensure that it's community-based research rather than research that's extractive and just kind of parachuting in and moving away. I know when I said I'm going to apply for my PhD, I had folks tell me, academics, that, well, you can't, you're too involved in like community work and political work, so I don't think it's a good space for you, but I am here now, right? And it's kind of deconstructing these expectations of who an academic is. So for a lot of Black scholars, like my trajectory to the Academy is not unique by any means. For a lot of Black scholars, a lot of us come here because of there's a social problem of anti-Black racism from intersectional perspective, and we just continue to study and we continue to try to find ways to deconstruct these social problems. So that's primarily why many of us are here. But then in terms of the Academy, for a lot of my students, I would be the first Black full-time faculty member that they've ever taken a class with, or the only throughout their entire program. So that's something that also would need to change in the Academy. And for those of us who are Black scholars, when we get here, not to be comfortable or happy or complacent in that, you know, I'm here, I arrived, or that sort of narrative, but how can I ensure that the spaces are being made more equitable, accessible, and working towards a process of decolonization? I'd also say the Academy, there are certain rewards, and I really like what you had to say, Marlon, about who gets access to different spaces, because there are certain rewards for outputs, right, and productivity. So a lot of the stuff I do in my free time is not considered productive work, but after this panel, I'm probably going to go to some campaign office, because I also think that's something I'll speak about later. I also think that has a role. Like, not all governments are the same. So we have to be very particular and choosy about who is representing different communities. So, you know, we have a municipal election on Monday, but at the same time, for the academic, that's not seen as academic work per se. That's work that I'm doing on my own time. So I think really recognizing some of the work that Black scholars take on and Indigenous scholars take on is often, like, our community-based work is not seen as real research, and it kind of takes away from that, but it's the reason why we're here. So you can't really remove yourselves from those practices as well.
Yeah, I would certainly agree, especially with the statement of who gets to occupy certain spaces. And I think as academics, we get into spaces that some communities cannot. I think about, you know, sitting in the House of Commons and looking across the room at members of parliament and thinking about how do I get them to understand the real impact of gun violence on the Black community. And, you know, I thought about the fact that I got the opportunity to enter that space. And they wouldn't be able to get that opportunity. But for academics doing work like I'm doing, work like you're doing, getting into those spaces is both a privilege, but it's also a pressure of representing community voices accurately. Research is the heart of what we do, and I think we have to question how we use our research to make a difference to the communities who are struggling. How do we use research to shift policies and to create change and to challenge the status quo? Because if our research doesn't challenge the status quo, then we really have to reflect on what values are guiding the research that we are doing. One of my dear colleagues would say that it's a missed opportunity for us as researchers if we seek only to advance epistemology and don't give credence to the values that guide our research, such as values of social justice and equity. She reminds us that research is about people. And so we have to transcend beyond the qualitative narrative and the quantitative numbers to elevate people's voices and their experiences, and to build a commitment through our research to elevate justice, right? So I think the first consideration for us as we think about where do we move with our research, you said it, Marlon, is the importance of how we tell the stories about especially Black and Indigenous youth, their experience in the criminal justice system. Are we telling it from a privileged lens? Those stories cannot be told from the perspective, a perspective that traumatize or re-traumatize or perpetuate stereotype about them. So as we even assess research, it's important for us to question from what social position and what social location is research about these groups being conducted, and how are they interpreted? And most importantly, I think it's important that we use our research to give back to community, to give back to the building of community. Like, you know, research can be, we can rethink how we do research. We should engage in intervention research, community-based research that will give community organizations, stakeholders an opportunity to share the data that comes from that research and build a process of empowerment when we, in the process of working with them. So yeah, we just have to rethink how we do research and who benefits from the research.
Thank you very much to all of you. Time has flown by, and I know we've blown past where I'm supposed to cut people off, I think. Hopefully we have time for questions. Great. Where should we start? Questions from the audience? Oh, someone coming.
Marcia. Easy questions.
Hi. So I actually have a comment and also to add something that Marlon said. So I have a biracial, and I'm constantly policing him, what he wears, how his hair, his dress, who he hangs out with. And it's really because I'm so afraid that some police officer is gonna pull up on him and harass him. And so my son actually pushes back. Most recently, he said, oops, Mom, I was shaving and I cut some lines in my eyebrows, and I'm freaking out because I'm saying, oh my gosh, this is a rap video right here in my house. So I'm just saying it is real, that anxiety that I carry every day. Regarding the 19 to 27, today I had a really interesting conversation with a very prominent Black woman who said she was invited to go to Western Collegiate, I think it's called, predominantly attended by Black youth. And she was invited to speak. And she asked who else would be there. And she was told that so far it's only you. And it's only after she said she would be there that the MP, the MPP, the school trustee actually said they would attend that event. And it's so very sad. And I actually, while you were speaking, pulled up the school, and an image that really struck me was that I went to images, and there's a young Black boy on the page of the school, and he is 18, apparently brought a gun to school, and the way they've titled it, Man Wanted, and you look at his face and he looks like a scared child. And I'm thinking, oh my gosh, every person who sees this, one, if you're not Black, you will not want to go to that school. And two, they're already they're sentencing him as an adult. And how sad. So I agree with you. More work needs to be done in this regard. Thank you. Not a question, I know.
To your point though around, because I think racial impact assessments,
Yes.
why can't schools for certain code conduct, whatever problems they have, why can't they have that, or why can't they use a restorative justice? You know, I don't know about the gun pieces because that's a whole different question, but schools could use some of these pieces when they're talking about suspensions. They could. They could think of the whole child and the whole youth versus just saying this one offense. So I think to your point around, there's some things that we could transfer over across systems and stop asking people in the school board to do it. Just tell them to do it, force them. Like how funders force us to do stuff. We could force them to do stuff. Could we give them money? Anyways, I'm off tangent.
There are questions. Oh, we do questions online.
We do have questions online, but our dean would like to add to the discussion. Well, he's going to come back on.
I don't want to jump the queue. If other people have questions, it's perfectly fine. I just wanted to make one comment because I can't let it slide. By the way, phenomenal panel and excellent discussion. I want to pick up on the point, however, during which we declared the Youth Criminal Justice Act to be a huge success. I just want to take a step back from that idea. You know, it is true, it is absolutely true that Ontario currently has the lowest rate of youth incarceration it has ever had. That is absolutely true. It's actually below 500. We have several secure custody facilities in Ontario right now that have no young people in them. They have full teams of staff, by the way. We're not sure what they're doing, but they have no young people in them at all. So in that sense, yes, indeed, the numbers have been sharply reduced, although that reduction has actually increased the disproportionality for Black youth. Because the kids who are not ending up in secure custody typically are not Black. So that's one issue. But I think the more important issue, and Janelle sort of began to address this, is that, you know, the issue is not youth criminal justice. The issue is coercion, confinement, containment, and compliance. And you can place coercion and direct it against particular social groups, in this case, Black youth, anywhere. It doesn't have to be in a secure custody facility. And we know that all our other systems, including notably schools, and especially high schools, but also elementary schools, and even daycare centers, feature a greater degree of coercion, compliance, conformity, and so on, than they have ever before. And so we shouldn't be fooled by lower numbers in secure custody and think that this in some way addresses the issue of coercive or carceral forces being imposed upon Black youth, also Indigenous youth. They're just shifted to other places. But when you become then concerned about the 19 to 27-year-olds, remember that they are coming out of carceral systems, whether they were in custody or not. And I think that really matters. You know, the ultimately, I think it's good to invest in the 19 to 27-year-old age group for sure, but I think not at the expense of investing in the yet to be born to zero age group, and notably in the coming parents of that age group. In other words, investing in young mothers, investing in young families, and investing in very young children across all social settings where they live their lives is absolutely critical. I don't think the Youth Criminal Justice Act, anywhere within it, suggests that its goal was to reduce incarceration entirely. Rather, its goal was to stop the revolving door that its predecessor, the Young Offenders Act, had caused. And I'm not really sure it has succeeded in that. It is still the same youth ending up in custody settings. And if they're not ending up there, they're ending up in school expulsion programs, they're ending up in suspension programs, they're even ending up in daycare suspension programs. So, you know, those are some serious issues. So it's too early for me to celebrate the success of the Youth Criminal Justice Act, quite honestly. But beyond that, I'm so deeply impressed with everything else in the conversation. So thank you very, very much for that.
You got a mic.
Yeah. I said we needed to uncomfortably accept that there was some success with the youth criminal justice system. Whether it was a political success, the fact that we have less youth incarcerated is a plus. does not mean, and I think no one here, and I think we've been promoting this for this entire panel, that investments across systems and the impact of systems on Black bodies and Black minds is the fundamental problem regardless. However, we have learned from our experiences in these different systems, some things that are working, and it's in our community's best interest to take the piece that's working, whether we think the rest of it is, like I like chicken leg, but sometimes I eat chicken back. If folks understand that, right? So there's some things that are working, and for us to get as a community, for us to get to the next, deal with the next piece of trauma, the next number, we have to take what has worked someplace else because they have already agreed to it. They've already funded it. We don't have to make an argument for it. We're just asking those who have decision-making powers to take this piece of thing that they said has worked, put it over here so it could work for the other thousands of Black boys and Black girls who are incarcerated. That's all we're asking. We're not asking it to solve all of the issues that the Black communities are facing. We're asking them to reduce the numbers of Black bodies inside our jails and penitentiaries. And can you do that with the existing policies and practices and legislation that you have? I'm arguing that we can do that. And we can go and ask political candidates to make that argument in Parliament, to make that argument with their assistant deputy ministers. How do you make this work for this age group? Because it's worked over here. You can have that conversation with those folks. Because I'm pointing at my good friend Louis. We've been asking for a whole bunch of changes for a long time, and we've gotten project-based funding, NORCOR funding. Every day we're trying to solve the same problem. That's the experience. We would like to see some systemic shifts. And systemic shift starts with legislation and where they put their money, because where the money goes is what's important. No money there, you're not important. That's the capitalist system we live in. So I'm not arguing that it's the best legislation there. What I'm arguing is there's something that's working there that we can move over here. And I think if you get 100 Black leaders in this city to have that conversation, I bet you 99 of them says, we think that might be able to work if it means that those Black bodies are out of jail and we could support their healing and supporting them having a different life experience. Absolutely, I think we could get that from the Black community. We know what we need. Sorry if I sound a little extra, but I'm tired of eating chicken back.
We have some audience questions, and just in the interest of time, I'm going to try and encapsulate, so it'll be a bit multifaceted here, but maybe you can, each of you can say something about what would be a practical approach to restorative justice? What might it look like for us as individuals and as communities? And how would that play out in terms of helping and raising children to thrive? What would it look like for someone who is a non-Black individual working in the legal profession? How can they support anti-oppressive practices? And how can it help young people in childcare?
So I think one way it can be addressed in childcare in particular, or with children, is to rather than saying, child A is in timeout for wrong behaviors towards child B, it's understanding, well, what is the race, gender, class, social location of child A, child B? So understanding the background factors, also understanding their families and their communities and how that might play into it, because a lot of the issues that happen at the school age is that often if a Black child and a white child is getting into an altercation, this has been well studied, the Black child is the one who gets punished or disciplined. So it's really looking at that, not just through that incident, not just through a colorblind lens, but thinking about what are the larger societal, racial, and social factors that play into this child-to-child dynamic, and having those ongoing discussions, not just in that moment where one child is being punished, but having them get used to having dialogue, conversation, to be able to relate with one another, to relate with their educators so they don't feel shame that they need to pull away from their educators and the adults in their lives. And then also letting parents and families know, because often when I did research with Black mothers, a lot of them say that they don't know when these altercations are taking place in these early childhood settings in the schools, and they're only finding out once their child is already like suspended or it's just too far gone. So having those open lines of communication is part of the relationship building. And then just building it in and incorporating it into everyday practices. So how can children relate to land and to their communities that are around them, and how can they feel moving away from disempowerment to empowerment is a way of really bringing it forward to that those childhood settings, I would say.
Okay, I'll talk about the legal bit. My perspective is, I'm just, right now my head is all on the bias in the neuroscience research, because to me, it just seems to tie everything together. The dehumanization piece is really fundamental, but also what actually works. And so I think there's maybe some disagreement about this, not necessarily in the research, but really what we're talking about with the effects of dehumanization, bias, et cetera, in our society, there isn't really a lot we can do in terms of trying to change those biases, right? Like, it is baked in everywhere. It is pervasive. And if you're focusing your energies on trying to say, I'm not racist, or I'm colorblind, or I'm going to change this perception of this particular group, which again, alarmingly, like you think about outgroups, like women, it's an outgroup. Like, it's just terrifying when you think about the after effects. So, okay, what can you do practically? Well, the research also tells you about proactive control measures. Again, another sort of academic language that only academics can come up with. But practically speaking, where we see the rubber hit the road is every decision that you're going to make, particularly in situations of scarcity, right? So if you are a person in a position of authority, for example, you're a teacher, and you're making a decision about a suspension. Okay, well, we know about a few proactive control measures. One, think about what are the criteria that you're supposed to apply when you're looking at a suspension, okay? And look at them before you exercise that decision. Why? Because the research tells us that tends to reduce the effect of bias, okay? Two, when you're dealing with certain populations, you should be upfront about the kind of biases that you have about these groups. They're more aggressive, more violent. And then when you're doing that decision, you ask yourself, okay, I've done this inventory. How is it possibly affecting my decision-making? Again, what does the research tell us? It tends to reduce the impact of bias on decisions. Now that is a lot of work, but you know what? Pilots do it with checklists. Courts in the US have been doing it with child welfare. It's a lot of work, but tough luck. It's the reality of where we live, of being a human being, and knowing that there are what we call outgroups, which are people who are marginalized people who have these disparate impacts, who really just get the short end of the stick. And so if you're in power and you have a decision to make, you're a lawyer, and you have a client who comes in front of you, you should be asking yourself, what are the presumptions that I'm making about that client? How's that impacting my decision about whether or not I should be retained by them? About the arguments that I'm making? When I'm walking in a court, am I focusing the judge on what the test is, what the test isn't, right? We see, for example, with what happened in Alberta, about Justice Camp, just gonna name it anyway, about the presumptions about what women should and should not be doing. Well, is that part of the test? Maybe what you have to do is, in framing it, say what the test is not, to focus the decision maker on what the criteria actually should be, to put things into context, to make sure that when they're exercising that discretion, they're exercising it in the right way to reduce bias. It's a lot of work, but I mean, that's tough luck.
And in those systems that we're talking about, the drivers around disproportionality, you could do that because we do that anyways. Researchers have to do it to some extent, right? Nonprofit organizations have to do it in their programs. We collect data all the time. We have checklists just the same. Our funders tell us what to do and how to do particular things. I just have a really hard time understanding, to your point, why can't we tell those systems, especially the ones that have the issues around disproportionality, what to do? I don't get it. Is it a political argument only? Is it a academic argument? What is it that we can't get to the point of when that principle, because in the school boards, they have their requirements before you suspend somebody. How are they held accountable for those checklists? Like, so I think that's a really good argument to make on, give us some checklists, tell us what to do. And I think you get a lot of people that would say, yes, tell me what to do.
To get to that other point about, okay, now we say what to do, I can tell you, hopefully I can tell you, I'm gonna say it anyway. In thinking about appeal, we had under the Education Act, directors of education are required to produce a report annually, but it could be whatever the heck they want it to be. So the idea was, all right, let's load this thing with every single possible conceivable measure. Because one of the questions that I constantly asked people was, how do you know if your board's healthy? Right? How do you know if your school's healthy? And often is, right? But how often do we think about that? Like, I have a law firm, and I was like, okay, Sean, well, how do you know your law firm's healthy? And then it got me thinking, holy crap, like I don't know. Like, what are the things that I need to start thinking about to measure that? Because when you have that approach of there's the measure, and now we see, okay, what are the criteria? And then we can say, okay, practically speaking, here's how to implement it. But you need that reflection of how you're doing. Anyway, I'm talking too much as a moderator.
Do you mind if I say something?
Oh, please. Oh, we have a mic. Just we have a virtual audience too.
Mic check. I think it's important to deal with the reality, and we have difficulty doing that because it's uncomfortable, as Marlon speaks. He's uncomfortable going to meetings. He's uncomfortable voicing realities. So a lot of people withdraw and they do not speak the truth when they come together. But my point that I want to make, and I think you guys need to listen to this, the decline in incarcerating rates is not real. The incarceration is now in staying at home. Instead of being in jail, they're on bail at home for 2 years waiting for charges. No, not for charges, for court cases. So they're in remand at home. They're not in the physical jail. They are at home. The calls that we get on a regular basis is somebody that is locked up at home with bail conditions that are inhuman, very restrictive, and in some cases worse than being in jail. One person I spoke to this week, today's what? Last week, he said he would rather be inside jail because he would be able to get medical attention that he can't do right now without a surety. we're seeing more and more, getting more and more calls from people at home, waiting 2 years to have their case heard. More inhuman than being in jail. Does that make any sense to anybody? That's the reality, right? So we're not celebrating the number of the decline in numbers that are physically. Speak to the mental toll, the mental health issues that these guys are at home, right? In 1979, Skadden Court Community Center, we had a provincial youth conference that spoke about police brutality, anti-Black racism. 1979. OISE was going to hold a conference, Canadian Civil Liberties Group, talking about police brutality and the amount of people that have been shot and killed by police in that period of time. And the police pulled out at the last second, said that they did not want to further create more anxiety in the city by discussing this in public. 1979. 1922, the police finally admit that there's racism within their operation, 43 years later. The way we see it, imagine a funnel when it comes to Black youth. The number of Black youth, well, first of all, the justice system is three pieces, right? You've got police and you've got the justice system and you've got corrections. And not the three of them don't work together, okay? That's one major problem. The second problem is for Black youth, because of over surveillance, the number of them going into the funnel is dramatically high. And the way out is small, is limited. Flip the funnel upside down, the amount of white youth, non-Blacks, getting into the funnel is small, but the numbers that access points out increases dramatically. Understand what I'm saying to you. The system is designed this way, and that's why we're having this panel discussion, right? But there's a lot more that needs to be said, so I just want to thank the people that are doing this, but encouraging you to do this more. And what Marlon said at the beginning about being uncomfortable being in these spaces, so am I. But we cannot be uncomfortable speaking realities, right? Because it has to be uncomfortable for it to be real. In terms of the gun violence, and thanks for the work that you're doing, the gun violence numbers have plateaued. I'm not gonna say it publicly, but we've been tracking the numbers for the last 9 years, it has plateaued. But what's happening is, and one of the things that was not discussed today is the role of the female, the young female. Now in gun, because they're holding guns for somebody else, they're playing around with guns and the charges and so on. We need to take a look at the new role of the young female in criminal activity, gun possession, and gun activity. So thanks again to the people that are doing this. I come here and I'm listening and I'm taking furious notes, right? But there's still so much more that needs to be added to the table. But I'm okay with this just being the beginning. So keep up the good work and okay, thanks.
Thank you for your comments. Robert Dixon coming, the last piece I'd say is, I encourage everyone to look at the work of Dr. Kwame McKenzie at the Wellesley Institute, which she talks about the health impacts of racism to make it very concrete, because that health piece is really important.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. I'm the Executive Director of Advancement and Marketing for the Faculty of Community Services, and my job here tonight is a very happy one, and it's simply to say thank you. Thank you for our marvellous panellists, to Annette Bailey, to Janelle Brady, to Marlon Moraro, and to our wonderful moderator, Sean Richard, for that fascinating and insightful discussion. Thank you so much for the wisdom, the experiences, and the challenges that you've shared with us this evening. Of course, this isn't the end of the conversation. We encourage you to keep in touch with us. For those in the room, join us at the back for drinks now. To follow the Lincoln Alexander School of Law and the Faculty of Community Services on Twitter, LinkedIn, and Instagram, and to check out the other amazing events happening in Alumni Month. The events keep going till the end of the month. We hope to see you again soon, but in the meantime, let's show our appreciation for our wonderful speakers here today. Thank you so much.
Don't hold me to anything I just said. Just kidding.